Albert Fish's story is one of the darkest chapters in true crime history. Born in 1870 in Washington, D.C., Hamilton Howard Albert Fish grew up in an environment of neglect, isolation, and psychological trauma. From a young age, Fish's behavior began to hint at the disturbing tendencies that would later define his life. This video will take you on a chilling journey through the life of Albert Fish, unraveling his troubled childhood, his heinous crimes, and the horrifying details of his murders. Viewer discretion is advised, as this story delves into some of the darkest aspects of human nature. Albert Fish was the youngest of 4 children born to parents who were significantly older than most of their peers. His father, Randall Fish, passed away, and Albert was just 5 years old, leaving his mother to struggle financially. Unable to care for her children, she sent Albert to St. John's Orphanage. It was here that Fish's horrifying transformation began. The orphanage was a place of severe abuse, where children were routinely beaten and humiliated. For most, this was a nightmare they sought to escape. But for Fish, it awakened a disturbing connection between pain and pleasure. He later admitted that he began to enjoy the physical punishment, laying the foundation for the sadistic behavior he would exhibit throughout his life. As an adult, Fish outwardly appeared like a harmless, quiet man. He worked as a painter, moved frequently, and had 6 children from his short-lived marriage. Yet, beneath his mild-mannered facade lay a mind consumed by depravity. Fish began developing obsessions with torture, cannibalism, and sadomasochism. He inserted needles into his body, whipped himself with spiked paddles, and even began drinking his own urine. His descent into madness was not just self-inflicted. He sought victims to fulfill his dark desires. Fish targeted vulnerable individuals, often children, whom he could easily manipulate. His crimes began escalating in the 1920s, turning him into one of America's most sadistic serial killers. One of Fish's most infamous crimes was the murder of Grace Budded, a case that shocked the nation. In 1928, Fish posed as a farmer named Frank Howard and visited the Budded family under the pretense of hiring their son Edward. Instead, he fixated on Grace, a 10-year-old girl. He convinced the Budds to let Grace accompany him to a fictitious party at his sister's home. They never saw her again. Fish took Grace to an abandoned house, where he committed unspeakable acts. The details he later revealed in a letter to Grace's parents were so grotesque that even seasoned detectives were horrified.
My dear Mrs. Budded, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Capt. John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body and is sold as veal cutlets, brings the highest price. John stayed there so long that he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to NY, he stole 2 boys 1/7, 1/11. He took them to his home, stripped them naked, and tied them up in a closet, and then burned everything they had on. Several times every day and night, he spanked them, tortured them to make their meat good and tender. First, he killed the 11-year-old boy because he had the fattest ass and of course the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except the head, bones, and guts. He was roasted in the oven, all of his ass, boiled, broiled, fried, and stewed. The little boy was next, and he went the same way. At that time, I was living at 490-100 sane. He told me so often how good human flesh was, and I made up my mind to taste it. On June 3, 1928, I called on you at 406 W15 ST and brought you pot cheese and strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat on my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in the closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run down the stairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take the meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was, roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though I could have if I wished. She died a virgin. On the pretense of taking her to a party, you said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She played in the grass. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. He hid in an upstairs bedroom, naked, so as not to get blood on his clothing, while Grace picked wildflowers in the yard. Then he called her inside. When she screamed at the sight of him, he grabbed her before she could flee. As his gruesome letter later reads, first, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take the meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body.
What set Albert Fish apart from other serial killers was his obsession with cannibalism and pain. In the infamous letter to the Budded family, Fish described not only how he murdered Grace, but how he cooked and ate her remains. He detailed how he derived pleasure from the act, not just in inflicting pain, but also in consuming his victims. This wasn't an isolated incident. Fish's other crimes involved similar acts of cannibalism and sadistic torture. His behavior was a nightmarish blend of physical and psychological horror, leaving an indelible scar on his victims' families. Fish's capture came after years of fruitless investigation into Grace Budd's disappearance. His downfall was a critical mistake, leaving an identifying detail on the envelope of the letter he sent to the Budded family. Detectives traced the envelope to a boarding house where Fish had stayed. When they confronted him, Fish confessed without hesitation. His calm demeanor and detailed recounting of his crimes sent shivers through the investigators. Albert Fish's trial was one of the most sensational in history. While his defense team argued that he was insane, the jury disagreed. They found him guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. On January 16, 1936, Fish was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. Even in his final moments, he remained eerily composed, reportedly calling the execution the supreme thrill of my life. Albert Fish's story is not just about his heinous crimes, but also a chilling look into the human psyche. What creates a monster like Albert Fish? Is it childhood trauma, mental illness, or pure evil? These are questions that continue to haunt criminologists and psychologists today. Fish left behind a legacy of horror, but his story serves as a reminder of the darkness that can lurk within humanity. and the importance of vigilance in protecting the vulnerable. Thank you for joining us in exploring the dark and twisted life of Albert Fish. If you found this story compelling, consider subscribing for more in-depth explorations of true crime and history. Stay safe and always be aware of the shadows that surround us.